Welcome to this week's Seesaw meeting. We have Abe Gong with the political civilometer, and Abe and Csaaw will be presenting on a cleansing body model. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so the first half of today is going to be all data, no model, like no theory, and then the second half is going to be all theory, no data. So on average, we're doing pretty well. And I know some people have to leave at the hour, so we'll excuse you then. Let me dive in first to talk about this project. So this is a chunk of my dissertation, which I call a political civilometer. And the goal is to create like a thermometer, a measuring tool that can measure civility in political discourse. So we'll take the first hour and talk about that, and you can help me make it better, I hope. Here's where we're going.
Congratulations, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. Well, let's speak to that. So,
the most important thing.
This is the. So I've gotten a lot done on my dissertation in the last year, and none of it's nearly as exciting or cute as my new baby daughter, Adeline. So, the fortune cookies are from my mom, and they all have baby daughter themed messages. She insisted that I bring them. It's being Mormon, I'm not going to pass out.
Would your mom made it yourself?
There are services where you can order fortune cookies with whatever you want inside them. And I was just telling Gene, I bet you could come up with a really fun party game around that. I'm not sure what it is yet. So anyway, this is Addie, and I'm also going to use Addie as an excuse. Sorry, Adeline, Addie. As an excuse for why some of this isn't quite done, because I just have not been getting that much sleep in the last couple of weeks. So here's where we're going. First, I'm going to talk about why we need a thermometer for civility. Then I'm going to go through a lit review, which I think about as 1,000,001 different definitions of civility.
That's 10 million.
Yeah. Gosh, it's hard to sleep. Yeah, 10 million. 10 million, the commas are in the wrong places. Then we'll talk about a la carte measurement, a phase-style measurement. And I'll explain that when we get there. We'll talk a little bit about crowdsourcing, and then we'll talk about implications and applications for this tool. And just because I know we're a little pressed on time, if you have clarifying questions along the way, please interrupt. If you have suggestions for improvement, and there are going to be a lot of those, I hope, because there are plenty of places this can be improved, let's save those for the end, and I'll make sure that we have time to go there. Come in. Look back at one. Okay, so motivation. Communication matters. There are all kinds of things that can go well or can go poorly depending on how we communicate about them. So we've got a bunch of examples. Bad communication leads to wrong left turns, leads to heartbreak, leads to dissatisfied customers, airplane crashes, dumb laws, hate crimes, wars. All kinds of things seem to be due in part to poor communication. So we can turn this into a model with arrows in it, because this is where social science starts happening. There's context, so situational factors, people's preferences, beliefs, psychological predispositions, just sort of the nature of the situation. Those influence the way people are going to talk about what's happening. And then how people talk about things tends to influence how decisions happen. So one of the things, this is the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy thing, but people seem to talk a whole lot before they actually do anything. Almost all social decisions have some communication phase in them. They depend, at least in part, on communication. And importantly, the quality of communication influences the quality of communication. So if we are negotiating over the price of a car, and I'll get that in a second, and I start off by calling you a really insulting name, you're likely to call me a really insulting name back, and I don't know what the final decision on that car is going to be, but it's likely to not be exactly what we would like starting on. Alex?
You're talking exclusively about like explicit conversation, not implicit communication. In your list of bad communication you included like states going to war, and often they're talking about implicit bargaining, not explicit bargaining.
Yes, so for this, I'm thinking mostly about the sort of communication that comes out of your mouth in the form of words.
Great.
But you can broaden the model and think about those other things too.
Okay.
So Communication can provide clues into the quality of relationships and into the context that is dictating a situation. Communication itself influences decisions, and so QED, the more we know about communication and the more we can improve it, the better we can make our social decisions. So I'm in political science, I think particularly about government, but I think the same thing probably applies to a lot of other areas in business and sociology and just any place where people get together and work together. Problem. We do a really bad job of talking about talking. So when you look at, there's a lot of discussion about communication and what makes for good communication or bad communication, but it all tends to be fairly abstract. And when you get down to it, it's not all that useful in a lot of cases. And I say this having read a lot of business books and a lot of stuff on deliberative democracy, just having read a lot in this area. So people disagree about which aspects of communication matter. We tend to talk about things in abstract terms, like, oh, we should have rational discourse, or we need to be respectful of each other. But those words mean different things to different people. So practically speaking, what that means is you can almost always justify bad communication that you happen to agree with on some grounds.
That's what the chair here.
Oh, okay.
Welcome, head of the table.
Yeah. No, that's the tail of the table. Thanks. Oops.
So my proposed solution to this problem is the scientist solution. I'm going to argue that until we can measure communication in really crisp, objective, replicable ways, we're not going to be able to improve it. So you can't improve it if you can't measure it, and all science begins with measurement. You have to observe and replicate. So the research questions for this project are, can we measure constructive discourse in a way that's theoretically satisfying, replicable with high reliability, and scalable? And I'll talk about why scalable is important later. So constructive discourse, this is the only definition that I'm going to give in this presentation. All the other definitions are going to come from other people. Constructive discourse I define as communication that promotes effective decision-making and legitimacy, even in the face of disagreement and potential conflict. So if we roll back a few slides, if constructive discourse is aspects of communication that make this better, that make for better decisions. So broader context on this, I'm studying political blogging, and when I first got into this, I thought, okay, well, you know, civility is a big deal. People talk about how much bloggers are incivil and shout at each other and all that. So I'll go out, I'll figure out who has researched civility already. I'll borrow their code books and their research, apply that to the blogosphere, and go from there. And what I found was I couldn't find a code book that I was satisfied with. I couldn't find anybody who had measured civility in a way that was really useful. Now, there's a lot of discussion of civility, but almost all of it suffers from one or more of these flaws. So one is that most discussion is normative. It talks about what people should say, how people should talk, but it doesn't actually talk about what people actually do. So it doesn't measure anything. It's high-minded, what we should be doing, but doesn't get into specifics of what that means. Another one is that a lot of it tends to be subjective, and I think the business literature is particularly guilty here. They'll say things like, you need to make sure that everyone on your team has the opportunity to express their ideas. And that sounds great, it's hard to disagree with, but I'm sure I can find you a manager who thinks that if you say, anybody disagree, counts as getting people to express their ideas. So it's basically, subjective means it's hard to bring it back and say for sure whether or not that kind of communication has happened. A third one, I'm not happy with this word, but I'm calling it downstream. Most psychological work, there's been quite a bit of psychological work, social psychology, on communication, but most of it makes communication the independent variable, and then something else is the dependent variable. So, for example, in media studies, you'll show people two examples of a political ad, and one will have scary music and angry pictures in the background, and the other one will be happy with butterflies and American flags and stuff. And then you measure that to see what sorts of differences that makes in the way people react to the ad. The problem there is the message is the independent variable, And so in order to construct that experiment, all you have to do is, from the enormous ocean of possible ways of expressing that idea, you pick two, you call one the treatment and one the control, and that's all you have. So it's very difficult to generalize from those small experiments to the whole, I shouldn't say small, but from those specific point-wise experiments to the whole universe of potential discourse. So that's what I mean when I say downstream. These are things that take communication or civility as the independent variable and not the dependent variable. Now finally, there are a handful of studies that do try and measure civility directly. And when I say a handful, I really mean enough that you can number them on the fingers of your hands. There are not very many of these. And every single one that I've found is narrow. It talks about communication in a very specific context. So there's a good paper that talks about civility in one of the European parliaments. I forget, it's Sweden or one of those. And they got a great code book for discussing civility in that context, but it doesn't work for American political blogs, and it doesn't work for most political discourse. There's another good paper that talks about Bill O'Reilly and basically how angry, not civil he is. And that's great, but the code book was designed specifically for Bill O'Reilly. It doesn't work in a lot of other places. So basically, I came into this project thinking I was going to borrow somebody else's tool, and discovered that there is no tool that does this, which was sort of shocking to me, and so we decided to fill that gap. So to start off with, I thought, let's look at all the places that talk about communication and decision-making. And this is not the full list. There are more than these, but these are the ones that we managed to go through in some detail. And when I say me, this is myself and a team of undergraduates who've been doing fairly extensive literature review of this. So we look at deliberative democracy, we look at negative campaigning. These are both in political science. We talk about journalism, the standards of journalism, psychology of groups, media violence, emotion and aggression, and then some things about negotiation, diplomacy, and team dynamics. And when I say team dynamics, this is mostly the business literature for how CEOs should run effective companies or managers. Now, this is not a complete list. There are other people who do talk about communication and decision making, but I like to think that this covers a pretty broad swath. We're getting a lot of different perspectives, and hopefully between these we're covering most of the ground. After going through those, we found, and I'll talk more about these later, 8 aspects of constructive discourse that seem to pop up over and over again. I'm trying to decide whether or not to bore you with these all at once. Let me give you a couple examples. So respect for others. People talk a lot about how it's important when you engage in dialogue of one kind or another to be respectful to people with opposing opinions. You can't just sort of stomp on people who disagree with you. That seems to be a broad pattern. It shows up in a lot of places. On a totally different level, there are people who talk about the value of entertainment. Now, some people say that good political discourse should be entertaining. Think of Jon Stewart, right? It's good if it's funny because that's engaging. It pulls people in. There are other people who say that if it's too entertaining, that it distracts people from the real message, from the real discourse that's there. And so you'll find a lot of embittered journalists who say, no, we need more things written like the New York Times because that's the way that political discourse should happen. So there are a lot of different aspects of political discourse that people say are important. Here's a loose summary. So this is many dozens, we're probably in the low hundreds of books and articles that we've read in all of those different literatures speaking to the 8 different characteristics. And here's our sort of battleship version of which aspects people say are important. Or since we're in complex systems, we can call it the game of life. Right?
Can you define public import?
Yes, so public import is, I should get out my definition so I'm actually giving you the right one. But loosely speaking, it's how much does the topic of discussion address matters of public governance. So is this a decision that needs to be made by society as a whole? So what's a good example? Which car should I buy? That's an individual decision that you can presumably make on your own. But should we have universal health care is a decision that, at least in the US, we're debating making in government, and so that's a collective decision of public import.
Abe, question. This is not quite fair, but along the following lines. Most scientists I know, in fact, a large majority of scientists I know,
are much more interested in saying what they're doing than listening to what others are doing. How does that fit into something like this, where they're trying to communicate in a way, but there's certainly not much signaling back and forth?
Mm-hmm. So the places where that would show up the most, I think, are under facts, sources, and evidence. So you need to listen to what other people are saying and incorporate that, cite appropriate sources. Respect for others, I suppose.
Yeah.
This is, are you willing to be persuaded by other opinions? And also divisive. We talked about that a little bit. So these sort of the hard science part of me resists putting these into 8 categories. I don't want to claim that these are the 8 magical categories that will solve all your problems. But I do want to claim that across these categories, we've covered most of the important ground. This is one of the things that comes out of this literature review. There are a few other... Thank you. There are a few other things that show up in these literatures, but almost all of them have either turned out to be narrow to a specific context or very difficult to measure. And so we think that these 8 cover most of what people are interested in. The other pattern I'd highlight here is there's almost no agreement among these different literatures on which of these things actually matter. So journalists are interested in discourse in a very different way than CEOs, who are interested in a very different way than social psychologists. And I don't want to claim that anybody is right or wrong here. The goal here is to uncover all of the major trends so that we can try and measure all of them. And that leads to, okay, don't show this message again. To what I'm calling a buffet style or an a la carte style of measuring constructive discourse. The approach we've taken for our empirics here is to take all of those 8 things and try and measure each of them in a way that's faithful to the underlying theories behind them, but to remain agnostic about which ones are really important. So actually several of the studies that I've read fall into the trap of saying, here's how I define civility. These are the important things. We're going to measure that and go forward from there. And then almost always when I've seen discussions around this, that devolves into a conversation about, well, you haven't measured this, you haven't measured that, you haven't really got at what's important. Since there's no consensus on what the important things are, we're not even going to try and go there, and instead the goal is just to... We've got a bunch of different code books, not all 8 printed correctly. So let me pass these around. Oh, those are the slides, sorry folks. And take one. Actually, we have more people than I expected, so I'm not sure if everyone will be able to have their own copy, but maybe you can share with the person next to you. Go ahead and just separate it out so you have 1 page. Yeah, so some of them are 2 pages, some of them are 1. What I want to do here is go through the exercise of actually coding an article, because this is where the rubber hits the road. Now that I think about it, it's maybe a poor article that don't show this message. Okay. So, has everybody, most people got a code book? We should have like 8 or 10.
They never make it around that way.
So we don't...
That's like
Well, let's at least get to this point, to the point where everybody can see these, so you understand what I'm talking about. And I guess actually going through the exercise won't work quite the way I expected it. So, as you can see, a code book is kind of like a survey. It's a short set of questions, but instead of in a survey asking about you and your opinions and your feelings, here the questions are all about a piece of text. So in this case, we are interested in this piece of text. This is a random blog article. I don't even know where it came from. I have an archive now of several 100,000 of these, basically drawn at random. And so when we say code an article, what we mean is read through the article a couple times till you understand what it's about and how it's approaching the topic, and then answer the questions in the code book. So let me steal this one. This is the objectivity code book. how well do these statements describe this text? Very well, somewhat well, a little well, or not well at all. This article is written in the first person, i.e. the author refers to him or herself using words like I, we, etc. What do you think? Is this not well at all? Yeah, I don't see any first-person pronouns here. This article is written in a formal style, like a traditional newspaper article. Yeah. Somewhat, very. Yeah. This article is written in a conversational style. No. Ideas in this article are presented as factual reporting, not just the author's opinion. Okay. Yeah, somewhat, very well. There's room for a little bit of disagreement here, but that's the exercise of content analysis of coding. There are more questions here, and this is just one of the 8 code books that we're working on developing. The point of this exercise is you go through, you make specific decisions about where that article falls, and I don't know if we would have all given exactly the same answers. In fact, I'd be surprised if we all said exactly the same thing. But in general, we're all saying yes in about the same places and no in about the same places. What that means is that when you go through and you run the statistics, our intercoder reliability should have been pretty high. Who's familiar with intercoder reliability? Who does this in there? Okay, but
I mean, I know the term, I don't do it.
okay, yeah, well, we'll take that for now. So the concept behind intercoder reliability is really objectivity. It's, do different people code the same article in the same way? If different people can look at the same article and come up with totally different answers, that's no good, right? You can't do science based on that. But if we can get intercoder reliability into a good place where we are close enough, then we're in good shape.
So this depends on the code book?
Yes.
Or depends on the article?
Depends on 3 things. Depends on the code book, depends on the article, and it depends on the coders. And their training, yes. And so
culture and stuff. I mean, all this.
Yes. Yes.
So, but you want to make the code book that would like,
Have a high.
yeah, I guess to dominate the like where.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the hard part in content analysis is writing a code book where totally different people can come to it and still come away with more or less the same conclusion. And that's surprisingly difficult. So I've spent the last several months working and reworking on these code books. And actually, this is the process. So try and develop a code book for each aspect of constructive discourse. Then take them and deploy them on Amazon Mechanical Turk. Weird name for a site. This is a crowdsourcing site. Let me just show it to you. So
your wireless is working.
that's a good question. Yeah. Well, we'll see. Nope.
I believe that still try to. If only there was something that told us it wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll have to wait on that then. So it's a site where people upload lots of batches of small tasks. This is built by computer scientists, basically because they discovered that artificial intelligence can't do everything. So if you want to go through and look at pictures that are being uploaded to the site and ask whether or not they're adult content, computers are not very good at doing that, but people can tell right away. Or if you want to go through and say, here are 2 shoes that have similar names that are being sold on this site. Are they the same item, or are they just kind of similar? People are really good at doing that. Computers are not so good. So MTurk, Amazon Mechanical Turk, is a site where people upload lots of tasks like that, and then other people log on, and for small amounts of money, small incremental amounts of money, they'll go through and do these things that the computer can't do for them. So in our case, what I do is I upload a lot of articles and all of these code books and ask people to go through and say things like, is this article written in a formal style? I don't know of a good way of showing a computer to do that right away, so people can do that pretty well. We can do it pretty reliably.
So are these reliability measures based on basically 2 people? So 200 times 2, so it's the first 2 coders that make your Mechanical Turk task.
Yes, but it's not the same 2 people all the way down all 200. So there are likely to be several dozen people who get involved in it. So it's not just 2 people, it's many people. One nice thing about this, well, let's talk about all the nice things. Pros of doing it this way is it's cheap. So I pay on the order of 5 to 10 cents per article, which is at an hourly rate, it's really pretty cheap. It's scalable, so you can do many hundreds or thousands of articles pretty quickly this way, way more than I could do, or way more than myself and a team of undergrads could do. It's pretty quick once you get it going. And the fact that we're using naive coders, so coders who did not build the codebook themselves, for example, means that the results should be replicable. Now, this is a hole in a lot of content analysis studies. Very often they'll say things like, we developed a codebook, and then they'll get very vague on exactly who's doing what. And they'll say, 2 coders went through and analyzed all the results and discussed what was going on. And what you usually realize is, oh, there were 2 co-authors. Those 2 co-authors, the same people who developed the codebook, the same people who are going through and using the codebook. So it's not completely replicable, not completely transparent. So doing this on mTurk actually puts up a high bar for replication, because if random people off the street in mTurk can't get in and code the articles reliably, then my reliability numbers won't be high enough. You'll know that right from the beginning. The cons for this, just in case anybody else is interested in this kind of research, there's a high startup cost. It takes quite a bit of work to get everything going. You don't get a whole lot of feedback from your coders, which makes it hard to improve the codebooks. You can tell it's not working, but you can't always tell what you should do to make it work. And there are people on mTurk who will scam it and just go through and click whatever and hope that you pay them anyway. So there's some trust issues. But I found that on the whole, the pros outweigh the cons by quite a bit. Okay, so, and that's as far as I've gotten on this. Just to let you know, so Addie interrupted. I had 2 weeks less than I was hoping to have, and I'm happy about that. But let me tell you some of the places where I'm hoping to take this next, and then get your ideas on how this can be improved, or if there are pitfalls that you see that I haven't seen yet. So one is automated text classification. It turns out that once you have several thousand articles coded by people, you can then feed those to a computer and say, basically, computer, here's a stack of objective and non-objective articles. Look at all the text, and the computer can go through and it can figure out which words correlate with which measures. And after that, then the computer can look at new text and pretty accurately classify it. So at some point, you don't even need Amazon Turk anymore. You can just turn the coding over to the computer. I've done this for other parts of my dissertation, coding political versus not political text. And it remains to be seen whether this will work on constructive discourse. I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that the computer will be able to do it, because that means that I'll be able to apply this on the scale of millions instead of just thousands. If we can apply it on the scale of millions, then we can do some really cool stuff. As I mentioned, I have a huge archive of political blog posts sitting in the background. So far, I've been sampling from that, picking and choosing to develop these code books. I would like to get to the point where we can code all of them, so we can get measures of objectivity and public import and all those parts of constructive discourse for every blog post. And then we can go through and we can do interesting things like saying which blogs are the most civil according to these objective measures. And we can take this outside of blogs, we could say New York Times comments. Are there articles where people are more civil or less civil? Are there topics that seem to attract more hot debate or less hot debate? And we can also look at things over time. So are there patterns in the way general discourse moves? These are things that people have speculated about, but we've never been able to measure before. So I'm really excited about, hopefully, being able to do that. And eventually, this is outside the scope of my dissertation, but maybe other people who do experiments would be interested in taking on things like this. Now that we've measured these different aspects of decision quality, we can start to build them into experiments in a more broad sense. So instead of just picking and choosing 1 or 2 examples that highlight exactly the difference we had in mind, we can start mapping more of the space of discourse and seeing how those different kinds of discourse influence decision making. So you could do that observationally, or you could actually do experiments. And then finally, and this is something I'd love to get your thoughts on, I'd love to try and publicize some of this by making a site, a website, which I'm thinking of as civilometer.com. So the idea is this would be a site that would have all the code books, so people can see what we're doing. They'd have all the data that we've collected so far, so that people can do replication studies, because that's where science happens. And then I'd also like to build in an API where people can upload their own articles and it will classify it for them. And maybe a game where you go through and you try and see how accurate are your perceptions of civility. And so the idea would be you would go through, you would code some articles, and then at the end the computer would basically give you a reliability score and say, how close are you to the average person or to the trained coders who've done this before? Now, if you can really get this going, you set up an interesting dynamic, because in the API, people give you new text. And in the game, you can slip in a few codings where people will give you new data. And so if this actually works, it becomes a data factory where I don't have to pay people on MTurk anymore. People are interested in doing this just to see what will happen. It becomes sort of a social good that people are willing to contribute to. I don't know if that's interesting or sexy enough that people actually do it, but I don't know, it's worth a shot. It's something I'm thinking about doing this summer. So let me conclude by breaking all rules of public discourse with a limerick. This is an ode to incivility in the blogosphere. In public forum, it surely is key to debate our ideas civilly. How do we do so? We haven't a clue, so we'll just bicker and bite endlessly. This is the way I see kind of the state of current discourse around public discourse. We don't have good definitions of what's civil and what's not, and almost anybody who is willing to make a claim about it also has a stake in the game, so they're not necessarily the most credible person. I would like to try and move past that. I don't know how far it will be possible to do so, but I'd like to move to the point where we have better objective measures of what makes for good communication. That's the overall goal. Thank you. Invite questions and comments.
I don't know what codebook you send around.
I sent several around, so not everybody sees the same thing.
Okay, at the bottom it says the author attempts to support his or her claims with outside facts, sources, and evidence. And I found it very interesting to talk about objectivity. So what constitutes outside facts? So if I read something on Fox News or blog, and all they quote as sources and as evidence are very conservative think tanks and whatever, yes, they're facts, but they very much aligned with the overall message. So what are outside facts? And B, one way of measuring objectivity in this context would be, so you talk about a certain topic, do they quote from a wide variety of sources? And that you should be able to get from links from, I don't know, from...
Yeah, that's a great comment. So basically what constitutes outside, and we're worried about what psychologists would call selective exposure, people only listening to what they already agree with. I think we have some questions on that, if not in that code book, then in one of the others. Jen?
So it seems to me that a lot of times, just as a general matter of science, progress comes from taking a concept and realizing that it's not really a big lumpy concept by itself, that we need to unpack it. So an example of this is in psychology, saying, well, we've always been talking about prejudice. It turns out that was sort of an abuse of the term, that there's not such a thing really as prejudice. There's different facets of it. There's different cognitive processes that go on. There's explicit prejudice and there's implicit prejudice. And the progress comes, the cutting edge comes when we look at those things separately. And so I guess my question is just, do you see yourself as unpacking this idea of civility? So I think maybe one thing you need to do is say, really, there's not such a thing as civility. There's these different things, and we need to take account of them separately. Versus, are you saying that there really is such a thing as civility that is deeply meaningful, or are you saying that we need to disassemble this thing that didn't really exist ever?
Mostly the second part. So I'm an empiricist. I think that and I've been in enough situations where there was just bad communication that I believe there is good communication and bad communication. But I think it's highly context dependent, and unless we unpack it, we won't be able to understand in which contexts, which styles of speech matter. Right? So here's an example: adversarial speech. In a court of law, it's just expected that if I'm a lawyer for one side, I'm going to argue one side, and the other guy's going to argue the other side. And that's the norm, and that seems to work reasonably well there. People debate whether or not it's the best way, but that seems to work well there. if I'm having a discussion with my wife Erin about something, that's not necessarily the best way to go. It doesn't always work for me to, say, this is why we're doing this, and I'm going to lay out my devastating opinions and reasons and go for the jugular and just try and knock around your idea down. So adversarial works sometimes, but not all the time. It's a blunt example, but I think it works. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Interesting thing there, though, Abe, and that is good lawyers try to anticipate what the other lawyer is going to drive toward.
Mm-hmm.
And so you've got this interior dialogue that might not be there otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of thing, I think, really enters into some of the more sophisticated civil discourse.
Yeah, that to me reminds me of what Alex was saying about strategic discourse, right? You might not just say whatever comes to your mind. You're really making moves in a rhetorical chess game.
Yeah.
I guess what I had in mind, sorry, just to come back to it, but it was your idea of the civilometer website. So that seems to me conceptually to say that there is such a thing as civility.
Sorry, I should have made this really clear. We wouldn't give you one number. We would give you 8 different numbers. So we'd say, this blog post is doing well for citing facts and evidence, but not so well for empathizing with the other side of this, or whatever the categories are. So unpacking, definitely. And then if you want to, you can say, well, these are the categories that matter to me. Let's score things that way. But I'm not going to force anybody to. I'm agnostic to that. I don't have strong beliefs on which ones are important. Alex?
So I think that you're right that adversarial discussion in a courthouse is very different than other kinds of discussion, for example. And I think that one thing that troubles me with this is you haven't clearly defined what kind of discourse in political blogs, which is what you're going to be looking at, I gather, is perceived as, I guess, civil or all of these different, constructive in particular. And that my conception of what constructive would be between two political blogs is very, very different than how I would, perceive to be between two diplomats. And right now, you're framing your problem as sort of this big idea thing for all kinds of communication. And I think you can do that sort of up front, but if you push a little harder on exactly the context that you're interested in, it's going to alleviate some of these concerns we have about, okay, well, the institutions that you're within matter, who your audience is matters, who your, how your audience perceives you matters, and that those are all, both formal and informal institutions that structure the communication. Well, you're not trying to answer all institutional context. You're actually trying to address a more narrow question than that, but you frame it early on as if it's, independent of that context, and that's, I think,
so I'd like to set up the measurement so that it works across many contexts, with the understanding that I'm going to be particularly interested in one.
Yeah.
So I think depending on what context you're in, which of these aspects matters will change, right? But I think in general, in almost any context, it will be some subset of these. When you talk about civility in a courthouse versus civility on a blog versus civility talking to a taxi driver,
I think you're underselling
context.
context.
What's that?
I think you're underselling context. I think frequently words are a signal of whether both somebody's intentions and that you perceive those words based on your priors about the person communicating them and whatever signals those words are sending. So you might be able to get at, though you're not trying to right now, the intention signaled by the words, except for perhaps in the objectivity measure. But you're not taking into account the context in which those words are being delivered, or the priors about the writer, priors about their audience, and the audience's priors about the speaker. And I think that that's a bigger part of communication than perhaps you're accepting at this point with sort of your set of measures.
Well, so let me see if this is a fair rephrasing of this. Whether or not a given speech is appropriate depends on the speech and the context in which the speech is delivered. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay, so I'm making a very deliberate decision here to not get into context, and I'm just trying to measure aspects of the speech itself. So on its own, these measures won't be sufficient to tell you whether or not a given type of speech was appropriate.
Right.
Right. Other people have to come to this with their own intuitions or their own measurements of contextual variables. But we should still be able to take these measures and apply them in different contexts. You just need to also have that information about what's appropriate in that context before you can make a judgment about whether it was good or bad.
Right. That's different than measuring sort of constructive civility in an overarching kind of way. Like
I suppose, but I can't think of another way you could get closer.
Okay.
Gene?
What does your data set look like for this?
Oh, I didn't talk about that very much. So the data set is the internet. It's really, really big. So I spent the first year of my dissertation finding all the English political blogs that are out there, and there are on the order of 500,000. And then the next big chunk, which I'm still working on, is downloading all. If you notice that a bunch of the scratch drives crashed downstairs, that was me. I put too much stuff on them. So I've downloaded, I don't even know how many zeros it has, but lots and lots of political blogs is the main backbone of the data set. So these are blogs that go back 10 years. There are like tens of thousands of them. And the data set is every single post around that. On top of that, I've also picked and chosen a few New York Times articles and then gotten all the comments from that. So that's a few thousand comments. And then from LexisNexis, you can download news articles, op-eds, things of that nature. And we have a few tens of thousands of those. And so far, the codebook applies pretty well to most of those things.
What about comments that have been removed?
From blogs?
Well, I've read some articles where this comment has been flagged for being inappropriate, and you can no longer. Does that factor into if you're trying to do something about the quality of comments?
Right. So
Yeah.
I guess we are truncating the distribution at the bottom. So if there are things that are just spam or totally inappropriate, those are probably cut before my crawlers get to them. Yeah. So I didn't talk about that a whole lot here, but this is definitely a big data project.
So do you, when you are storing the data, so you have each article, and then do you have these 8 dimensions, or do you store the individual responses, or how are you? What does the data look like for any particular article, as far as you're using it right now?
For the articles that are being hand-coded, we have the article, and then for each coder, we have all of their responses on each codebook. So we have all the fine-grained granular data.
But when you intend to start using it, how do you think?
So it turns out that the intercoder reliability for individual questions is sort of medium good. It's pretty good. But when you combine them together into aggregate scales, it gets really good. So we get kind of wisdom of crowd stuff. So when I go to computer coding, automated coding, I plan to just store 8 numbers for each one. But I'm not actually there yet. So that's just what I plan to do. Mm-hmm.
So did I hear that right? So you're planning eventually to have like a sort of automated, since this one's developed, like, and that would be looking at the corpus, so like looking at the text in some sense, trying to figure out. Okay, very cool. Well, another application would be, it seems, well, I mean, among other things, would be you have commercial application of this. I've heard a lot of kerfuffle recently online about people who want better ways to moderate their comments.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this would be one way to do it.
Yeah,
I think it'd be very interesting. Just like you could develop a filter that eventually would filter out, everything that have all caps, right? Everything with.
Yeah. Well, so this would actually be a little bit smarter than that. There are some of those floating around.
No, I know. But
there's one that's just launched a couple weeks, or I just saw an article about its launch a couple weeks ago called Stupid Filter.
Okay.
And that's exactly what they're trying to do. They're
Good.
looking for misspellings and capital letters and exclamation points.
Yeah.
I think this is similar, but a step or two more nuanced.
Yeah.
It's probably overkill for most commercial applications.
Well, no, that would be a boon to humanity.
There's an XKCD on that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. This is the first time in a while I've done a presentation without XKCD. Thank you for bringing that up.
Do you have any demographic data on the people who are actually coding right now?
What do you know about that?
That's a great question. What I'm planning to do is, after the fact, I will get back in touch with all the MTurkers, the workers who are coding it, and ask them to take a survey and just get some basic demographic data that way.
Turns out they all come from Alabama.
It's possible. So there is some pretty good demographic data on who is on MTurk in general. That doesn't necessarily carry over to the people who are doing my task because they get to select in. But in general, in MTurk, people are a little bit more likely. Actually, the modal person is like somebody who has been graduated, a woman who graduated from college 3 years ago. It's kind of your typical person on MTurk.
So
Among the U.S., I should say, and I'm filtering this by only coders in the U.S. because there are big cultural differences.
So the reason why I'm asking, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Jonathan Haidt. So he looks at the way typical Republican and typical Democratic voters, how they think differently. And so I would be very interested to see if someone comes from the Republican side, because they tend to be more focused on very few dimensions of an argument, whereas Democratic, they can take in 20, whatever. The Republican, more black and white. So if they read an article and they have to code something like divisiveness, a Republican will say, this is not divisive.
Mm-hmm. That's just the way it is.
And a Democrat will say it's totally because all they talk about is black and white.
Yeah.
So
that is so for my purposes in this, I'm hoping that there aren't big differences like that, because that makes it more, it doesn't make it impossible, but it's harder to defend the validity of a code book. On the other hand, if there are predictable differences in the way people code, then you can bake that into the statistical algorithm and take it into account. And it would be really interesting to know.
It might just be interesting what kinds of articles have wider variation in how they're coded than others.
Yes. So when I talk about very large-scale data analysis, that's the kind of things I'm really interested in.
This kind of article, nobody can agree whether it's divisive or not. This kind of article, everybody can agree whether it's divisive or not. That would be really interesting.
Yeah, so you're talking about variation itself as being...
Intercoder reliability actually being an interesting variable here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If this is just broad speculation, but do you think somebody further down the line could make, so to speak, a simple agent-based model that reflects some of this?
So, yeah. One thing that I've thought about doing is when you take comment threads on newspapers, they're chronological, right? Or well, you can sort them in a number of different ways, but they're often chronological, and people will respond to each other. And sometimes the people use like @ signs so you can tell who they're responding to. I think you could probably build, I don't know if it'd be a statistical model or an agent-based model, but you could build something where people look at what's been written, decide how to respond, and over time you would get an emergent pattern in what's the broad pattern of civility that unfolds around different articles. I think that'd be really interesting to do.
Yeah.
And it's...
It would be like path dependent, because I think a lot of times the first few commenters set the tone.
Yeah, I think that would be really interesting to know, actually. And you could do the same thing for, say, town hall meetings or op-eds on a given subject. It'd be really interesting to know how path-dependent are conversations, right? Man, I just got out of this terrible meeting. We didn't get anything done, and everybody was angry at each other. You step back and you think, okay, did that meeting just have to happen that way? Right? Did we all go in with conflicting views, and so it was always going to be an angry meeting? Or is it because Joe spoke up, and man, Joe is just a jerk, and I wish he hadn't talked first? Right? I hope there are no Joes in the
In which case, you might be the divisive figure.
yeah, possibly. There may be an eye of the beholder problem.
Joe's just a jerk.
Yeah. I tried whispering at the back of the meeting, and it just didn't seem to improve anything.
Yeah.
So when I talk about trying to improve teams and decision-making overall, that's the kind of thing I'm thinking about here. We need to close and go on to Calais, but let me just kind of make our pitch for Boon to Humanity. We really haven't, we talk a lot about communication. It's clearly important to us as people. Like it's not just a scientific thing, it matters for how we live. We don't know that much about it, and until recently, we haven't been able to measure it very well. So I'm hoping that by measuring it, we really can start to improve it. We can come up with new, I don't know about laws, but we can come up with new principles and guidelines for improving the way we communicate, making better decisions. That's the goal.
Thank you.
Yeah.